Welcome to the Fane of Fantasy. My name is Jesper, and this channel, as you know, is all about giving you inspiration for your own fantasy creation. And today I have somebody here to help me. So David have joined me from the US. It is late afternoon for me, but early morning for him. So welcome to the Fane of Fantasy, David.
All right, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, and maybe you just want to start by sharing a bit about yourself, and so people can get to know who you are.
All right, so my name's David Stuart. I am a writer, I'm an author, and I'm also a musician. My education training is in music, and I taught music for a lot of years, but I never gave up on writing, and I took it up more seriously a couple years ago. Published a few books, which you can check out at davidvstuart.com and find out about those. And some of them are free, and some of them are cheap. So those are both good. I prefer to write in the fantasy and science fiction genres. I've written in both genres, and I enjoy them. Right now, I'm focusing on the fantasy genre, and this month I will be demonstrating my writing process for National Novel Writing Month.
Very cool. And we kind of set out today to discuss something that I think is very relevant and should be very inspirational also for those of you watching this video. So we want to explore this kind of triangle between setting, characters, and plot. And I know you have some good thoughts on this stuff, David. So won't you lead us in?
Yeah. So I think it's really important, and I do this with analysis on my own YouTube channel, to talk about the relationship between setting, characters, and plot. And I kind of look at it like your setting is sort of everything that contains the world that your story is existing in, the time, the place, the culture, all those things. The characters obviously live in that setting, so the characters have their traits and their personality derived from the world that they live in. They have to inhabit accurately the world they live in. So if you're writing, say, a historical fiction novel, you wouldn't want like a 11th century Japanese libertarian or somebody talking about Platonic demerges or something like that. That person would have the attitudes that would be appropriate for that particular setting. And then lastly, the plot is executed by your characters. So your characters, I guess you could write a plot where the characters have no effect on it, but that doesn't sound interesting to me. So usually your characters are executing the story. They're meaningfully trying to do something to achieve a goal. And so what plot is possible is also based on your setting. And so the example that I like to give, there's actually a couple examples, but the one that I think is really great, and probably a lot of people already know if you're into fantasy, is Way of Kings, or the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. The third book of which is coming out this month at some point, and I'm sure I'll read it. But he constructed a world where it's completely racked by storms all the time. There's these incredibly heavy storms that just destroy everything. And so from that starting point, all the other things arise. Like the plant life, there's this grass that sucks into the earth to protect itself from the storms. You can't have normal plant life that we're familiar with. The sort of animal wildlife is very insectoid because it's more durable and it can withstand the storms, and all the adaptations of the world are built around these horrifically powerful storms, including the way that people live, the shelters that they live in, their culture, their society. Everything's sort of built around that. Even their currency is sort of powered by these magical storms. And so all the characters' attitudes that are born out of that, and all the cultures that are born out of that, determine what those characters think is possible and what their motivations are and what they do. And especially in that first book, you could see all those things sort of work together to produce a really unique tale that where the setting is its own living thing. The characters are interesting because of that living setting, and then the plot, which is it's a classic plot, but it's very well executed, and it feels new and original, even if the techniques he's using are not new. They've been used in other books. Because of how unique that setting is, the whole thing ends up feeling really original when you read it, especially your first time through.
Yeah, and I mean, when done really well, like here in your example, the setting almost kind of becomes a character on its own, because it takes up so much of the experience. So that is really awesome when the setting can play a large part in the whole thing like that.
Yeah, I think for fans of fantasy, I think the setting is probably the most important part, and by setting I'm including all the stuff, the magic system, all the world building stuff that you talk about, because that's what differentiates it from all the stuff that isn't really fantasy, right? The imagination that goes into creating the world is what makes fantasy unique among literature, in a way that you don't get from historical fiction. Even if historical fiction is a different sort of world than what you're familiar with, it's not the same as fantasy, because fantasy can be something completely unique and completely new and completely different and worthy of its own interest when you're reading. That's the big draw of fantasy to me.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And the thing is also, if you're dealing with a historical fiction, or as you said, or even to some extent like urban fantasy, of course you will have your magic system at play there as well. But in traditional like epic fantasy, the world building also takes a part, just for the simple fact that it is a different world. So you have to spend some time explaining it, and if it's not, nobody will know it because it's nothing like our current world. So because of that, you also have to put thinking into it. You have to make it unique, as you say as well, make it different, not seen a million times before, because then it just becomes very boring very fast. But in this kind of triangle between setting, characters, and plot, if you can make those three elements work together, then you have your hands on something really strong.
Yeah. And what I think is kind of cool too is that, a lot of the people connect with characters a lot too. And if you have a cool setting, if you have a setting that's unique, then those characters are also unique and also interesting, and also people really will attach themselves to them, because you can get character traits and character attitudes that are just different combinations than what you get sort of in the real world, if you were writing very realist fiction. And you can write realist fantasy. There's authors that do it, but even if you're doing that setting will just end up affecting how cool that character ends up being, how different he is. You can also do this in science fiction. Let me sort of bring that into it. So I wrote a book called Prophet of the Godseed, and what's kind of cool about this is sort of, it's got a lot of interstellar travel. This first book is focused around one planet. They're visiting one planet, and that planet is tidally locked, meaning one side of the planet is always facing the sun. And so I started with that idea, and I said, what would a world look like? And how would you live on a world if one side was always facing the sun? And so what I kind of got there is, well, if there's no day and there's no night, you can't live on the sunny side because you burn up. You can't live on the dark side because you'd freeze. You can only live kind of in the middle where the sun was sort of twilight. So the sun, if you live there, you have to think of another way of keeping track of time. So the idea of day night is not there. So they talked about cycles, sleep cycles. And so the day that they came up with, I might have actually edited this out of the book, was like the sleep cycle that people normally end up having, which was like 21 hours, right? And it wasn't like a regular day. And then the precipitation that happened was storms that were made on the sunny side and then passed over into the dark side before snowing over there. And then you had rivers that if you had a usable river, it would flow to the sunny side. If you wanted to kill somebody, you'd go bring them out into the sunny side, which is going to be like very desert. Nothing can live there because of how intense the sun is. And then it's like Dune, like Dune on one side, and then Ice Planet Hoth on the other side, and in the middle, kind of a paradise of eternal twilight.
Right.
And then that affected the culture too. To the way I was looking at it, is I had two cultures, one who lived kind of on the dark side because it was impossible to live on the light side. They lived on the dark side with the aid of technology to stay warm. And they were the people who embraced technology. And then the other culture was a culture that rejected technology to a certain extent. And they were essentially warring with each other. And the culture that was embracing technology was becoming more and more integrated with their technology in a dangerous way. And so that all of those things ended up playing out with the plot. The perception of the characters, because they're from this culture that had this eternal conflict. They ended up with polygamous marriage because men, obviously, if you have eternal war, men die. Men are the ones who execute the war, so they're dying at higher rates, which means that those who survive, there's an excess of females. You end up having polygamous marriage, right? And we can see this in other cultures on Earth. So I kind of like, okay, that affects this, and then that produces this effect where there's a polygamous marriage in one of these societies, and in the other one, maybe there's not, because they view their warfare and they view their culture differently. And though it's odd, it's an adaptation to the way the world was built. So it started with one idea, the world was totally locked, and then everything else kind of had to surround that idea. And how would you live in a world that was like that? And like, obviously, the people who live in that middle ring, they don't need air conditioning because the climate's always the same, right? So you live in a place where it's always 70 degrees. Why would you need air conditioning, right? Or it's always 30 Celsius. You don't really need air conditioning. It's just a nice temperature all year round. So they didn't have windows, right? Windows were just open, and because why would you need them? You just have a roof to keep the rain off your head. That's it.
And I think that is an excellent example on how the setting itself. I mean, once you came up with that idea, it's already to some extent driving into some of the plot. It kind of locks some stuff into place. So that is very interesting. And I also, from the character's perspective, I don't know what you think about it. If you can give you can give your thoughts on this. But from my perspective, if you had to choose anything of this stuff, I always claim that characters are the most important thing. If you create characters, let me put it the other way around. If you have the most amazing setting ever created, you have a really unique, interesting plot, you'll still have a good story on your hands. But if your character sucks, nobody will like it.
Yeah, I completely agree, because that's the human face of it. And it's your job as an author to not just have a character that executes a plot, but to have a character that people like, or people want to succeed or don't want to succeed, a character that people hate. I don't know if people like the Thomas Covenant Chronicles, but it's a character that you really don't like. And so when people talk about why they don't like those series of books, it's usually because they hate the main character. They find him really despicable, which is something the author wanted to do. Well, the problem with that is that doesn't necessarily produce a good reader experience, even if it produces a unique story. And I kind of like those novels for what they are, but I don't sit around and like, when I'm reading them, I don't really care about how that main character is going to succeed or why. I think it'd be okay if he died, right? Because he's kind of not a cool guy. But if you create those really good characters, that's what people attach themselves to. I firmly believe Game of Thrones is successful because of its characters. I don't think the way the plot goes, because George R.R. Martin's such a gardener, I don't think it would be successful if he wasn't good at making characters that were at least very, very interesting for people to attach themselves to. Same thing with Stephen King's writing. Stephen King is actually not that good at plot, in my opinion, especially in the last third of a book. But you care about the character so much by the time you get there that you don't, any kind of missteps on the story, you don't seem to remember them, right? You kind of, it's okay because the characters are so good.
Yeah, that's true. I just had a thought there. Once you read fantasy, you also read it to some extent because you want to get transported into this imaginary world. But if you don't have anybody in there who you root for, then it gets like, that kind of, it's great. This is a great setting, but I need somebody to root for. I need somebody who I can feel, okay, I'm on these people's side. But admittedly as well, it is extremely difficult to find the right balance with the character to make them interested enough, but also make them likable. So there will always be some people who like certain characters, not and same other people who doesn't like the same character. That's kind of just a thing of it. But now you just mentioned Game of Thrones there, because I have like a I have a view on one of because I agree with you that they have very, very good characters, and they all George R. R. Martin is also very, very good in giving us the insights to understand why they are behaving the way they are behaving. We understand their motives and so forth. The only one I had a bit trouble with, and to some extent I still do, was Jaime Lannister. So when he in the beginning pushed the kid out of the tower window, it's just like, you have to be really careful what you make the characters do, because something is just unforgivable, and it's very, very hard to come back from. And it looks, I mean, at least in the HBO series, they've just done so much over the last couple of seasons, in my point of view at least, to try to make him very likable. They've kind of changed him to be a much more likable characters and so forth. But at least to me,
remember that first
action still sticks there.
Impression that he chucked a kid out the window.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I found him more interesting as a more Machiavellian type of power seeker, but every character I think every story needs some characters that aren't likable as well.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes unlikable characters that are very good at succeeding. Going back to Brandon Sanderson, there's this sort of antagonistic character, and there's a point in one of the novels where he just really gets what's coming to him. And it's just so satisfying. And you understand his perspective. Like you get why he's doing what he's doing, but you never like him because he's just, he doesn't do likable things. And so when he finally gets what's coming to him, even though he should be like an ally, it's just like, oh man, I can't believe you actually gave me what I wanted. That was, that was great. You read through 2 giant tomes, and then finally he gets what's coming to him, and you're like, yes, that was great.
Yeah.
So I think every character every story needs some of those foils. I think of another series. I don't know if you've read like Malazan Book of the Fallen.
No.
So that's a really monumental series by Steven Erikson. I do recommend it. It's not for the light of heart. It's the way he approaches his world building is through the characters. He doesn't sit there and tell you how the world is. You watch the characters do their thing, and then you, as the reader, have to construct how the world works based on those clues. That I find very interesting. Other people won't like it as much. They'll be a little bit confused by the setting. But his characters, there's so many likable characters that you can kind of get pulled through a couple of the books without even understanding how the world works, because you care about those characters and their objectives. There's this group of friends, the group of soldiers called the Bridge Burners, and each one has sort of a unique personality, and you get kind of attached to them and what they want to do in sort of their daily lives. So it just kind of pulls you through, even though you may not have any clue how the world works. You end up liking the characters. And then there's a lot of paragons too that he gives you some insights to that are really interesting, godlike characters, and you kind of root for them or kind of root against them, or even if they're evil, there's some evil characters that you kind of root for because they're just so cool.
It's like Darth Vader.
Yeah. And so that one's one where the setting is really, really so expansive, and the characters really are born out of that setting. They have these really specific attitudes based on where their origin is in that world, that I think it's a great example of how that world building can produce really cool characters. I think maybe Steven Erikson's problem is that there's so many characters. Some of them a reader's bound to not care about and then get bored of in a book, right? You're like, oh, it's this guy again. I don't care about this guy. Why are we reading about him? He's dumb. Give me back the other guy. Where's Whiskey Jack?
Yeah, I picked up somewhere on, I can't remember where on the internet, somewhere on one of the last books of Song and Ice, A Song of Ice and Fire, where somebody complained about what was it? Some prince from what is that, Eberron? Oh, no, what was it called, that island over there?
I don't remember.
No,
It's been so long since I read.
but
And I
somebody
don't
just
even watch
complained
the
like
series.
we got like half a book following somebody like we didn't know before, and it's like, why do I need to learn about this character? So there is certainly something about making it relevant as well to I mean, the setting and the plot and the characters in this whole triangle, that it's relevant. We understand the motivations of these people, we understand how they connect with the world, we understand how they are, or why they are acting the way they are acting towards the plot, and we don't, I mean, if you, at least to me, if you get too many of these outlying characters that just there for, like a plot vehicle, they're just there to drive something forward, and it's it's a bit troublesome sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's I think that's always a danger too. If you're an author, you don't always have a great idea of what the reader is going to find interesting. You know what you find interesting, and you know all about the character that you're writing, but you don't always have a great idea of what the reader's attitude toward it. And I think Robert Jordan actually fell into that trap with several of the Wheel of Time books, the infamous like book 7, 8, 9 in the Wheel of Time series, where nothing happens, right? So the characters are just sort of talking to each other for like 3 books. And if you really like all the characters, then you're still going to like those books. But if you liked the way that the setting and the world was unfolding and the way the story was progressing, things kind of stall out in those books. And so they have a reputation of being bad. But I think a big part of the reputation is that there's so much time focused on these semi-auxiliary characters to the story. Like, there's Perrin and Matt, who aren't the Dragon Reborn. It's not that they're unimportant, but we have like whole books where we're following them around while they do nothing important. And some people didn't like, especially I think the character Perrin. I guess a lot of fans, I don't dislike him. A lot of fans really didn't like him. So they were very, very annoyed that they got essentially a whole book of him. It's like, oh man, this book's like 60% Perrin. I hate him.
Yeah, I mean, there is of course goods and bads. I mean, you'll never be able to make characters that everybody like, and I don't even think you should try either. But I'm glad you brought up the Wheel of Time, because it's an excellent example, kind of what we're talking about here. Because I gave up on book 6 after I couldn't read anymore after that. But I have to say that the world building that Robert Jordan did in those books is absolutely amazing. It is done so well and so detailed. It's kind of completely Tolkien. But the problem again here, when it then comes to the other parts of this triangle, so you have amazing. This kind of goes to what I said at the beginning, I guess. You have your setting that is absolutely amazing. The plot is at its core in Wheel of Time is also solid. That it's an interesting story, but the characters that drives is just like you just said, and that's why I gave up on book 6, because you can follow and sometimes you'll read like 4 chapters, 100 pages or something, and nothing has happened other than they left one room to go into another. And it's like, what the hell? Do I need to spend 100
just
pages?
Talking. And he tugged her braid. I'm like, tugged her braid and looked incredulously over it. It's so you read these characters just sort of acting out dialogue with each other, but the dialogue doesn't tell you anything. So dialogue's a good thing to talk about, because dialogue is what exposes so much of the character, especially if you're doing a writing from a perspective where it's not omniscient, where you're not just like jumping between heads, which is actually really hard to do. I think, James Clavell did it in his books well, but I think it's really hard to pull off. So you usually have one viewpoint character, or maybe you're writing the first person. Well, that other character, all that the audience is going to know from him is the way he talks. And so dialogue is really important for having your characters develop and showing who they are. But by the time you get to like book 6 in a series, the characters need to be acting, not exposing who they are. We know who they are. We read the other 5 books. And I don't know, maybe there was something in the publishing industry 20 years ago where it's like, no, you have to have character development in every single book, because someone might pick up book 6 at the airport and want to read it on a plane and not know who the characters are. I'm like, I don't think that that's a really good approach to fantasy. Like, I don't see too many people picking up Return of the King at the airport and skipping the first 2 Lord of the Rings books. Like, it just seems, that would seem baffling to me, like to do that as a reader. Let me start on book 6. I'm sure it's cool. Like, I don't know anyone who would do that, right? So you just kind of stall out. You have a lot of dialogue. The characters aren't really developing because they've already been exposed. They need to act in order to develop from that point on. You know, just like a person, you don't change who you are by just talking to other people. You change who you are by going out and experiencing something and doing something. So that kind of lack of action also makes the characters stall out, and then they just, all the annoying things that you may have forgiven in book like 1 through 5, which are great. I have this trouble with Wheel of Time because it's like, I so love the first 5 books, and then about book 6 it starts to get not so great, and then by book 7 it's just not very fun to read, and then you kind of slog on, and then it gets better at the end once the story picks up. But by that time the story is good enough that the characters you don't like acting in that story, you're kind of okay with it. And I think Egwene is a character that I ended up really not liking. So anytime that she was being talked about, I was just like, I turned on like my speed reading mode and just started just like skimming pages, like, okay, where's the important bits so I could get back to reading about something that I care about, because I just couldn't stand her by the end of the book series. And I think everyone who read Wheel of Time had some character that they just did not like and did not like reading about. There was something about their mannerisms, and the fact that Robert Jordan goes into those mannerisms in detail. Sure, tugging her braid. Nynaeve tugged her braid. It's like, I don't it gets a little mind-numbing after a while. And actually that detail that Robert Jordan uses, which is so good in the first books for showing you the world, becomes cumbersome once you know the world. And so there's a lesson.
I mean, I fully respect people who like the Wheel of Time, so I'm not out to bash it at all. I mean, it is an excellent piece of work, and there is so much detail in it. So, but it's just not to my personal liking, I must admit. Usually in the books, he also spent maybe the first 150 pages, which is more or less just a summary of what happened in the previous books. Which I can understand if you are picking, or maybe in traditional publishing, there's 3 years between each release. Maybe it's very good to have this, and also it's to some extent a matter of preference as well. In my own books, for example, in book 2, it just jumps straight into what's going on. I don't use any words on explaining what happened previously. So somebody has also complained about that. So it's kind of it's up. I mean, some people like something and others don't. I just personally don't like to have the whole summary first. I mean, I don't understand why I need that. I suppose since it's a trilogy, you would have read the first book before you pick up book number 2. But
that's how I feel about it. Now, I think you can split the difference, and if you take a cue from Tolkien, if you pick up Two Towers, there's a summary of the first, just a rote summary of this happened in the first book at the beginning of Two Towers, and this happened in the first 2 books at the beginning of Return. You could put that in because a reader who read the book is just, he can read it or skip it.
You know, or a prologue, maybe.
And it's, a little prologue that explains that. That would probably be splitting the difference. And I have to contend with that as I am developing my series as well. I personally, I'm like you, I prefer, let's just jump into the story, and we already know what happened, and I want to get to the next parts that are happening. And that's actually something I very much appreciate about Steven Erikson, as well as he doesn't waste time. If he doesn't waste time, the exposition happens in the story. He doesn't even waste time on exposition, even though the tomes are quite large, you know, in excess of 200,000 words for every book in the series, if I remember correctly. They're big books. He doesn't have this sort of long beginning chapter of like, the world is like this. You kind of discover it as you go. And he doesn't tell you anything about the previous books when you pick up the next book. It's just that book's story. That's where you're in it. Exactly. And if you haven't read the first book, I kind of realized in the second book, you didn't really need to read the first book to understand the second book, because the second book was its own story. And you learned so much about that story through that book. you didn't, even though the events in the first book were very important, you didn't need them to understand the story of the second book and the plot of the second book. And I guess that's another way to do it too, that I respect as well. And Malazan is not going to be for everybody. Just saying that. Some people are going to hate it.
It is what it is, yeah. Okay, David, so we are basically kind of coming up on time here, but is there anything like between this triangle of setting, characters, and plot, is there like one important thing that we need to mention in closing up here?
I think I think a lot of times it's easy to think of everything going towards the plot. But it's okay to, if you're writing a story, because you're the creator, right? You can alter elements of the setting if you need to help the plot be accomplished. So some people draw maps. I love drawing maps, and in fact, that's how I knew your channel, is that I was like, I want to know how to draw maps better, and so I found your channel.
I love it.
And I did draw a map for my last fantasy book, but I didn't really draw the map until I was done with the story. I knew what the world looked like, and I knew where things were. But in some cases, it's okay. It's like, if you want your characters to traverse a mountain range, you can alter your world to have a mountain range there, right? If you need to. So sometimes it can work backwards. If you feel like there's a story you want to tell, you can always tweak that setting and those characters a little bit to have the plot events that you want to happen. So that can work backwards as well, but you don't want to start with, I want to tell a story that has these plot events and then kind of put it on top of a setting. They have to work together.
Yeah, as I say in my book on fantasy map making as well, I say in there, story always trumps the map. So if the story demands something, that's what it is, not the other way around. So the map should never force the story in a certain direction.
So I agree with that. And so I think it's cool to draw maps, and I love to draw maps, but it's okay to alter those maps if you need something to be a little bit different than what it is. And in a lot of cases, I've read fantasy books without ever looking at the map, and I didn't need it because the story by itself and the characters were so interesting. I never felt like I needed to go look at the geography to understand what they were doing.
Oh, I always get so disappointed if I open a fantasy book and there's no map. I want a map every single time, no matter.
I think the map adds a lot personally, and I really tried hard to put a good map in my last book, because I think it is a trope, but it adds so much more realism to the world. When you look at a map, you're like, that's what the world looks like. It's just when I look at one of Tolkien's maps, it's like I can feel the world alive on that page just looking at the map. Even though he hand drew it with a pen 80 years ago, it's still amazing that he thought about all those things, and you can see it just gives it an extra bit of reality. So I do love maps as well, but sometimes I look at the map at the beginning, I'm like, awesome, and then I don't go back and look at it sometimes because I'm just too into the story.
Oh, it's been so great talking to you, David. I think we could go on and on and on here, but we also need to get wrap up. Is there any things you would like to plug here at the end, where people can find you and stuff like that?
Yeah, so you can find me at davidvstuart.com. That has all my projects. I actually put out like an album just recently. Here it is. It's like ambient rock. Maybe there's some ambient rock and jazz fans in there. That's kind of what it is. Who knows? I write books. So here's the last book that I put out. It's a fantasy book called Water of Awakening, which I'm very proud of. And I'll show you the map.
Yeah, please.
So here's the map. It's a hand-drawn map that I then did the text for in Inkscape. And I did a little video on how I did that because my handwriting for doing the letters, I didn't feel confident on. So I did the letters on a computer, but I hand drew all of the geography. And that was, once I finally did that, it felt like my world finally felt like it was real. And so I do appreciate your content on map making and stuff too. That really helped me a lot. And so that's my last fantasy book. I'm really happy and proud about that. You can read my historical fantasy book, Muramasa Blooddrinker. It's feudal Japan, but there's magic. So there you go.
Cool.
This one tends to be the fan favorite. Most people say that this is my best book, and I can kind of see why. It's good. I just executed all the stuff correctly, and people people just, they like it. I don't know why.
Well done.
And then here's my little sci-fi book, Prophet of the God Seed, if you're into sci-fi. This is hard sci-fi. You don't travel faster than the speed of light. That's what made the world building for this. So because you can't travel faster than the speed of light, everything else has to flow from that. And here's a little fairy tale that you can get for free, actually, on Amazon, the ebook called Garmish and the Farmer. That's part of my fantasy world as well. So I do appreciate you giving me the chance to talk to you and to plug my books. You can also read my updates at dvspress.com for my little National Novel Writing Month thing that I'm doing. What I'm trying to do this November is not just write 50,000 words, which is part of National Novel Writing Month, but to write a 50,000 word complete book and publish it in 30 days. So I'm doing 4 phases. I did the planning phase the first day. I planned the entire book in one day. And then I'm going to draft for about 21 days, about 3 weeks, do the initial draft. And then I'm going to revise for a week. My revision process is pretty quick because of the way that I tend to write. I don't need quite as much revision. I feel like if you plan well and you world build well, then you don't have as much cleanup to do after you write the story. That's my experience. So I'll revise for a week, and the last 3 days I will be doing all the publication stuff, which is going to be book cover design, putting it out on Amazon and other retailers. And so I'm going to try to demonstrate those processes, and you can follow me along at dvspress.com. And my YouTube is youtube.com/rpmfidel, RPMFIDEL. And I do lots of analysis on books and movies there, as well as just general talking about philosophy. And I also have a lot of guitar lessons on it too. So there you go.
Cool. Very good to have you here, David. And if you email me some links afterwards, then I will make sure for you guys watching I'll put it in the description field below so that you can just click through there onto to learn more about David if you want. So thanks a lot for coming. I think this was a good video, and feel free to comment below in the comment section below as well, guys, on what you got out of this this talk we had here. So thanks a lot, David.
All right. Thank you, Jesper.